Alara Voss stood in the shadow of the massive observation window aboard the starship Sovereign, watching as the endless stars streaked by. The hum of the ship's engines felt distant, almost drowned out by the weight of her thoughts. She had never expected this mission to be easy, but even now, staring into the abyss of space, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had already gone terribly wrong. The galaxy she had been thrust into was on the brink. Ancient species, once unified under the Galactic Council, now stood divided by a web of fractured alliances, bitter histories, and cutthroat ambitions. It had taken humanity years to establish a foothold in the stars, but with that progress came fear, a fear that humanity, despite its promises of peace, was a wild card in a galaxy ruled by power and bloodshed. Ilara's mission was clear: unite the divided factions of the galaxy before they tore each other apart. But the first step in that mission, her arrival at Arixis, had been disastrous. The Thryn and Vulcan, two species locked in an endless war, had refused to listen to reason. Violence had erupted the moment she set foot on their war-torn planet, and the carefully orchestrated peace talks had ended in chaos. Now, instead of peace, Ilara was left with nothing but distrust and bloodshed. Ilara sighed, her breath steady and controlled, but inside, she felt the burden of her failure weighing heavily. Humanity had been given a chance to prove they were more than just another species out for power, but the odds were stacked against her. The Thryn saw the Vulcan as traitors, and the Vulcan considered the Thryn nothing more than ruthless conquerors. Neither side trusted humanity, and she had walked into a battlefield, unprepared for the depth of the hatred between them. Ambassador Voss, a voice broke her thoughts, low and formal. Ilara turned to see Captain Rowland, the commander of the Sovereign, standing at attention. He was a tall, wiry man, his face hardened by years of military service, but his eyes carried a glimmer of respect for her diplomatic mission. "Report," Ilara said quietly, her gaze still fixed on the stars. "The fleet is in position, Ambassador," Captain Rowland said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "We've secured the outer perimeter of the Thryn and Vulcan territories, but we're receiving reports of increasing hostilities on the surface. It seems that despite your negotiations, both sides are preparing for another round of fighting." Ilara nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. She had hoped that the brief ceasefire she'd brokered would hold, but it seemed that the old grudges ran deeper than she had anticipated. "I'll need to speak with their leaders again," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "We can't afford another failure. Not now." Captain Raylan hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Ambassador, with all due respect, I think it's time we reconsider our approach. We've been here for days, and tensions are rising faster than we can control them. Perhaps—" "No," Ilara cut him off, her voice firm. "I will not give up on them. We have one chance to stop this war. We have one chance to prove that humanity is capable of something greater than destruction, and I will not be the one to let it slip away." Rowland held her gaze for a long moment before giving a stiff nod. "Understood, Ambassador, but you should know? There are rumors. Whispers of a third party fueling the flames of war from the shadows. Some believe it's the Syndicate." Ilara froze. The Syndicate. She had heard the name mentioned in hushed tones, a shadowy faction with far-reaching influence, but their motives had remained unclear. To hear the name spoken openly now only confirmed her suspicions. "Keep monitoring the situation," she said quietly. "If the Syndicate is involved, it changes everything." As Rowland left to carry out her orders, Ilara's mind raced. The Syndicate had the resources to manipulate entire systems, sowing distrust and chaos in their wake. If they were truly behind the unrest on Arixis, it meant that the galaxy was facing an enemy unlike any it had seen before, an enemy who thrived on division and disorder. With a grim resolve, Ilara turned away from the observation window. The battle ahead would not be fought with weapons or fleets. It would be fought with words, with trust, and with the hope that the galaxy could still be saved from the brink of annihilation. Her journey had only just begun. The Sovereign hung in the outer orbit of Eryxis, the blue and green planet glowing beneath them like a fragile jewel. From space, it appeared serene, untouched by the chaos raging below, but Ilara knew better. The peace she had hoped to broker was slipping away with each passing hour. Her meeting with the Thryn and Vulcan leaders had been the beginning of something far darker. Now, she had to face the truth. The war wasn't just about ancient grievances. Something, or someone, was deliberately keeping the flames of conflict burning. "Ambassador, we've received new intelligence." Captain Rallan's voice came over the comms, startling her from her thoughts. "There's been a series of unmarked transports leaving the Vulcan capital. They're carrying military-grade supplies, including weapons that haven't been seen in decades." Ilara's heart sank. The Vulcan had always prided themselves on their honor, but if they were arming themselves with such force, it meant they were preparing for more than just defense. It was clear that they were being provoked. No one acted this aggressively without outside influence. "I'll speak with their council immediately," Ilara replied, standing up and adjusting the jacket of her diplomatic uniform. "Prepare a shuttle." Within minutes, she was on her way to the surface, her mind racing. She had tried to appeal to their leaders with diplomacy, with reason, but if they were turning to arms, it meant her efforts had failed. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The shuttle descended through the thick atmosphere of Eryxis, turbulence shaking the small craft. As they neared the capital, Ilara could see the scars of war. Burned-out buildings, smoke rising from distant areas, and military patrols moving through the streets. The once thriving city had become a battleground. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the very atmosphere was charged with hostility. The shuttle landed in the heart of the Vulcan capital, where Ilara was greeted by High Commander Korak, the leader of the Vulcan forces. He was tall, with a muscular frame and sharp, angular features, his eyes cold with the weight of years of conflict. His once pristine armor was now marred by the grime of battle, and his presence alone made it clear that diplomacy was the last thing on his mind. "Ambassador Voss," Korak's voice was low, his gaze piercing. "I see you've come to witness our preparation for the inevitable. Do you still believe there's hope for peace, or are you here to watch as we defend ourselves from the inevitable aggression of the Thryn?" "I came here to stop that aggression, Commander," Ilara said firmly, refusing to be intimidated. "I came to stop you from destroying everything." He scoffed, turning away as he gestured for her to follow him into a war room filled with holographic displays and tactical maps. "The Thryn have attacked our colonies for decades, Ambassador. Their so-called peace talks are just a cover for their expansion. They won't stop until we are nothing but slaves to their will. And you believe that arming yourself to the teeth is the solution?" Ilara asked, struggling to keep her voice calm. "This only escalates the conflict. If you continue this path, there will be no peace." Korak's eyes hardened. "You don't understand. You're an outsider, just like all the others. The Thryn want our destruction. They see our way of life as a threat. What choice do we have but to fight back? Have you considered the possibility that someone else is feeding this hatred?" Ilara asked, her voice tinged with urgency. "That someone is intentionally making sure this war never ends." He paused, his expression faltering for the briefest moment. "What are you suggesting?" "The Syndicate," Ilara said, her voice low. "They've been manipulating factions for years, pushing them toward war. They want chaos, Commander. The more the galaxy fights, the stronger they grow." Korak's eyes narrowed, his face hardening again. "The Syndicate is a myth, a ghost story told by the weak to explain their failures." "It's not a myth," Ilara said, her tone firm. "The Syndicate is real, and they are using both you and the Thryn to create a war they can control. If you don't stop, you will play right into their hands." For a long moment, there was silence. Korak's gaze flickered, as if he was considering her words, but the walls of his conviction were too thick. Finally, he spoke again, his voice laced with frustration. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. "We'll never be free unless we take action." Just as Ilara was about to respond, a sudden explosion rocked the building, sending debris flying. The room went dark, alarms blaring as panic spread throughout the complex. A second blast followed, this one louder, closer, too close. "What in the hell?" Korak bellowed, drawing his weapon. "We've been hit. Stay down." Ilara shouted, pushing him to the floor as another blast shook the building. She scrambled to her feet, heart racing. Something was wrong. This wasn't just an attack, it was coordinated. Outside, the sounds of chaos erupted. The Syndicate's influence was spreading faster than she could have imagined. It was too late for negotiations. The war had already begun, and she had. The building was collapsing around them, its reinforced walls groaning under the pressure of the blasts. Ilara ducked behind a desk, her mind racing. Korak had already taken off in search of the attackers, but she stayed put, trying to process everything she had just learned. The Syndicate was real. They weren't just manipulating the Thryn and Vulcan, they were controlling everything, pushing both factions toward war in a deadly dance. The attack wasn't just an act of violence, it was a message. The Syndicate was reminding her that they were watching, that they had eyes everywhere, and that any attempt to interfere with their plans would be met with force. She pulled herself up from behind the desk, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had to get out to warn her people, but every exit was blocked. The building was locked down, and her comms were jammed. She had no way of knowing if the Sovereign was even still in orbit. "Ambassador Voss," a voice shouted from across the room. Ilara turned to see a group of Vulcan soldiers rushing toward her, their faces a mixture of determination and fear. "The perimeter's been breached. We need to evacuate now." Ilara didn't hesitate. She followed the soldiers through the collapsing hallways, the sounds of distant gunfire and explosions growing louder. Korak's earlier words echoed in her mind. He had been so certain that the Thryn were the true enemy, but now she was beginning to see the bigger picture. The Syndicate had orchestrated everything, their war, their hatred, their fear. They thrived on division, on keeping everyone at each other's throats. The soldiers led her through a side exit, and she was immediately met with the chaotic streets of the Vulcan capital. Smoke billowed into the sky, and panicked civilians scrambled for safety as military vehicles sped past them, heading toward the front lines. Ilara could see the Vulcan forces mobilizing, preparing for another fight, their fear and anger turning the streets into a war zone. "What's happening?" she demanded of a nearby officer as they passed. "We're under attack," the officer replied, breathless. "The Thryn have launched a full-scale assault on our western flank. They're using new weapons, sophisticated tech we haven't seen before. This wasn't just a raid. They're trying to break through our defenses." Ilara's stomach twisted. This was no longer just about the Vulcan and Thryn. This was a coordinated attack designed to escalate the conflict beyond repair. The Syndicate had ensured that both sides would believe they were under threat, pushing them further toward the brink of war. "I need to speak to Korak," she said urgently. "Where is he?" "He's with the High Command," the officer replied. "But..." Ilara didn't wait for him to finish. She broke away from the group, weaving through the crowd toward the military headquarters. Her thoughts were clouded with questions. Who was supplying the Thryn with these new weapons? How had they obtained technology so advanced? And why hadn't Korak trusted her when she warned him about the Syndicate? She reached the headquarters and burst through the main doors, but what she found inside was worse than anything she could have imagined. Korak stood at the head of a war table, flanked by his generals. But instead of the fierce resolve she had expected, his face was dark with fury and confusion. In front of him, a holographic display showed the movements of the Thryn fleet, but something was off. The ships weren't following the usual attack patterns. They were strategically retreating, pulling back just as the Vulcan forces were pushing forward. It was an intentional misdirection. "Commander," Ilara called out, stepping forward, "this isn't what it seems. The Thryn aren't the ones you need to fight." Korak looked up, his eyes wild. "And who the hell do you think you're talking about, Ambassador? The Thryn have launched a full-scale invasion. We're at war." "No," Ilara said, stepping closer. "You're being played. The Syndicate is behind all of this. They've been fueling both sides, making sure you fight each other. You're fighting a shadow enemy, Commander." Korak slammed his fist onto the table, sending the holographic display flickering. "Enough with your conspiracy theories. My people are dying, Ambassador. I'm not going to sit around and wait for some mythical organization to decide my fate." Ilara's eyes narrowed. This was the moment where everything would change. If Korak couldn't see the truth, then she was truly alone in this fight. "You don't understand," she said, her voice steely. "The Syndicate is playing both sides, and you're too blinded by hate to see it. If you continue this war, you'll be handing them everything they want. The galaxy will burn, and the Syndicate will be the only force left standing." Korak's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He turned away from her, staring at the battle plans on the table. The weight of his decision hung heavy in the air. "I don't have time for your idealism, Ambassador," he muttered. "But you'd better be right. If I find out you're wrong about this—" "I'll make you a promise," Ilara interrupted, her voice calm but unwavering. "If you stop this war, if you listen to me and help expose the Syndicate, I will make sure the Vulcan people get the justice they deserve. I will fight for you, Korak, but we need to stop this now." Korak hesitated, the fire in his eyes slowly dimming. He glanced back at the war table, his mind clearly torn. "Fine," he said gruffly, "but I'm watching you, Ambassador. If this all goes to hell, don't say I didn't warn you." Ilara nodded, a sense of resolve settling in. The road ahead would be even more dangerous now that she had earned Korak's reluctant trust. But one thing was clear. The Syndicate's grip on the galaxy was tightening, and if she couldn't expose them soon, there might be no galaxy left to save. Ilara's mind was racing as she left the Vulcan Command Center. Korak's reluctant agreement to her plan was a small victory, but it was clear he still didn't trust her fully. That mistrust was dangerous. It could undo everything. The stakes had escalated from mere diplomacy to survival, and Ilara needed to act quickly before the Syndicate tightened its grip further. The streets of the Vulcan capital were still in chaos. The sounds of distant firefights and the shrill wail of alarms echoed through the city. A sense of urgency filled the air, as if the very fabric of the planet was on the verge of unraveling. Ilara could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The Vulcan had been a proud, warrior race for centuries. They had fought and survived countless battles, but this was different. This wasn't just about war. This was about manipulation on a galactic scale. She couldn't fight this war with weapons alone. The Syndicate was smarter than that. They were not a group of simple mercenaries. They were strategic, insidious, and far-reaching. If she was going to defeat them, she needed more than just Korak's army. She needed information, but where could she find it? "Ilara, we have a situation," came Raylan's voice over her comms, pulling her from her thoughts. "What is it?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "We've intercepted a communication," Raylan replied. "A ship is on its way to Erixus, one of the Syndicate's flagged vessels. We don't know its contents yet, but it's headed straight for the heart of the conflict." Ilara's eyes narrowed. The Syndicate wasn't hiding anymore. They were making their move. The ship could be the key to understanding their plans. If she could intercept it, she might be able to turn the tide in her favor. "I'll rendezvous with the ship," Ilara said, already moving toward the shuttle bay. "Have the fleet stand by. No one gets in our way." By the time she reached the landing platform, the air was thick with tension. Raylan and a small team of soldiers were already preparing for the operation. They had just received word that the Syndicate ship was nearing Orcs's orbit, and they needed to act fast. Elara didn't hesitate. With a quick nod to Rallin, she boarded a sleek, fast-response shuttle and took off, the engines roaring as they broke through the atmosphere. The shuttle sliced through the air, cutting a path toward the coordinates they had received. As they neared the Syndicate vessel, Elara's thoughts turned to the tenuous alliance she had forged with Korak. She wasn't sure how much longer it would hold. The Vulcan had always been suspicious of outsiders, and even if they were forced to acknowledge the Syndicate's threat, the memories of their long-standing hatred of the Thryn would not be easily forgotten. She would have to find a way to prove that the Syndicate wasn't just a threat to one faction, but to all factions. The Syndicate ship was a sleek, black vessel designed for speed and stealth. It was surrounded by a cloud of smaller, unmanned drones, likely the ship's first line of defense. Elara's team had prepared for this, but there was no guarantee they would be able to stop the ship from entering the planetary system. "Ready weapons," Rallin called out. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers." The ship's sensors flickered as they closed the gap. Elara could see the Syndicate ship clearly now, a sleek, ominous silhouette against the backdrop of Orcs's swirling clouds. It was almost too perfect, too methodical in its movements. The Syndicate wasn't just trying to reach Orcs, they were orchestrating something bigger. Perhaps it wasn't just weapons they were transporting, but something more devastating: intel, resources, or even agents embedded deep within the factions of the galaxy. "Ambassador, the Syndicate ship is refusing to respond to hails," Rellin said, his voice tight with tension. "They're cloaking their signals. They know we're here." "Keep your distance," Elara ordered, her voice sharp. "We'll need to board her. If we can't disable the ship, we'll have to find another way to gather intelligence." The shuttle lurched as they made a sudden turn to avoid a volley of fire from the Syndicate ship's defensive drones. Elara's heart pounded in her chest as Rallin expertly maneuvered the shuttle to avoid the fire, but it was clear they couldn't stay on the offensive for long. "We're too close," Rallin said, grimacing. "We need to board now or risk being destroyed." Elara made a snap decision. "Prepare a boarding party. We take the ship by force." The shuttle approached the Syndicate vessel, closing in on one of the docking ports. A final barrage of fire from the drones slammed into their shields, sending the shuttle into a sudden spin. But Rallin steadied the craft at the last second, bringing it into position near a vulnerable section of the Syndicate ship. Elara and her team suited up quickly, stepping into the airlock. The cold, sterile air of the Syndicate ship hit them the moment the door opened. The interior was eerily quiet, dimly lit by low-hanging lights. Elara motioned for her team to fan out, weapons drawn. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "The Syndicate is here, and we're about to find out just how deep they've buried their claws in the galaxy." They moved through the ship's corridors cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick metal flooring. Elara's gut churned with anticipation. The answers she needed were somewhere within these walls, answers that could expose the Syndicate and, with any luck, stop them before they destroyed everything. As they reached the central command deck, Elara felt the presence of something, or someone, waiting for them. A sharp metallic clang echoed through the narrow hallway ahead, and Elara held her breath. Something was wrong. The command deck of the Syndicate ship was eerily silent, save for the distant hum of the ship's engines. Elara motioned for her team to take up positions, her pulse quickening with each step toward the central chamber. This was the moment. They had to gather intelligence, and they had to do it now. The Syndicate's web of manipulation and control had already spread too far, and if they didn't act quickly, the war between the Vulcan and Thryn would be nothing compared to what the Syndicate had planned. As they approached the door to the control room, Elara's comms crackled. Rallin's voice was low, urgent. "Ambassador, we've got movement. Syndicate agents, at least 24. They've activated security protocols. You need to move fast." "Understood," Elara replied, her voice steady, though her heart raced. She didn't have much time. If the syndicate agents were already mobilizing, it meant they knew they had been compromised, and they would do everything in their power to protect whatever secrets were hidden here. The door to the command room slid open with a hiss, revealing a sprawling central control hub. The walls were lined with holographic displays, each one showing maps of the galaxy, military troop movements, and data streams far beyond what Elara had expected. It wasn't just weaponry or resources they were smuggling, it was the entire fabric of the galaxy's power structure, and the Syndicate had their fingers in every pie. But Elara didn't have time to process it all. She and her team rushed into the room, weapons raised, scanning for any signs of hostile movement. A few seconds passed, then another, silence. She held her breath. They were close, too close for comfort. Where were the Syndicate agents? Then, without warning, the floor beneath them rumbled as a trap was triggered. The overhead lights flickered, casting an unsettling glow over the room. A sudden explosion of energy surged through the room, and Elara's team scrambled for cover as the walls morphed before their eyes. It was a defense system, an automated lockdown. The Syndicate had anticipated this kind of intrusion. Elara, Rellen's voice crackled over the comms. Get to the main console. We've lost contact with your team. We can't track you through the interference. Roger that, Elara replied, signaling to her team to move out. Stay sharp. They're trying to isolate us. Find the data cores. We need to get the intel. As they advanced deeper into the control room, the door to a central chamber slid open. Elara's breath caught as they entered. It wasn't just a war room. It was a control center for an entire network of agents. Syndicate operatives sat at consoles, their faces obscured by dark visors. They were working furiously, typing commands into their terminals. One of them, a woman with sharp, calculating eyes, turned her head, sensing their presence. It's too late, the woman said, her voice cold and calm. You're already too deep. You can't stop the Syndicate. Elara's mind raced. This woman wasn't just an agent, she was high-ranking, someone who knew the full extent of the Syndicate's plans. She had to act fast. You're wrong, Elara said, stepping forward, her voice laced with authority. The Syndicate is already unraveling. You think you're controlling the galaxy, but you're just puppets, and your strings are about to be cut. The woman's lips curled into a smile, though it was devoid of any warmth. You still don't understand, do you? The Syndicate doesn't control the galaxy. We are the galaxy. Every government, every faction, every conflict, it all serves our purpose. You think you're fighting for peace, but in the end, you'll be nothing more than another tool in our hands. Your people will fall, one by one, and the chaos will be ours to command. A cold shiver ran down Elara's spine, but she didn't back down. You're wrong, she said again, more firmly this time. The galaxy will unite against you, and I'm going to make sure of it. Before the Syndicate operative could respond, the ground shook once more, and the command room's door slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud. Elara barely had time to react before the walls began to shift again. The room was transforming into a prison. She and her team were trapped. Rallin, she shouted into her comms, her voice filled with urgency. I need a way out, now. On the comms, Rallin's voice was frantic. I can't get through the interference. You're on your own, Ambassador. Elara's pulse raced. They had been led into a trap. The Syndicate had anticipated their every move. They had expected her to find the heart of their operation, but they had never intended to let her leave. The operative at the console stood up, her smile never fading. I've been waiting for you. You're a brave little diplomat, but it won't matter. This war you're trying to stop, it's already written. There's nothing you can do now. Elara's eyes narrowed, her voice cold as steel. We'll see about that. In one swift motion, she pulled a hidden blade from her side and threw it with precision, disabling one of the consoles that was controlling the room's lockdown. Sparks flew as the system short-circuited, but the walls didn't immediately stop closing. It wasn't enough, she needed more. The operative moved toward her, reaching for a sidearm. Elara took a deep breath and launched herself forward, engaging in a brief but intense struggle. She was outnumbered, but she had something the Syndicate didn't, the will to fight for something more than their twisted vision of control. As the woman fell back, Elara took a deep breath, knowing that she had one last chance to stop the Syndicate, and that it would all come down to this. The Syndicate operative, disarmed but still dangerous, glared at Elara as she stumbled back from the fight. The room was now a tangle of malfunctioning consoles and flickering lights. The automated lockdown had been temporarily disabled, but the Syndicate wasn't going to let her escape without a fight. Elara's pulse raced, and for the first time since she had stepped foot on this ship, she felt the weight of the odds against her. The operative, now kneeling but still defiant, wiped blood from her lip and stared up at Elara with a cold, calculating gaze. "You think you can stop us?" she spat. "You're just one person, and even now, your people, your precious Vulcan and Thrin, are already tearing themselves apart. No matter how many battles you fight, you'll never win the war. The Syndicate controls everything. Your alliances, your armies, your leaders, they're all ours." Elara stood over her, breathing heavily. There was no time to argue, no time for her usual diplomacy. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "Who's behind this?" Elara demanded. "Who's really in charge? Who's pulling the strings?" The operative laughed bitterly. "You think it's one person? One face you can fight and defeat? You're naive. The Syndicate is an idea. It's not about power, it's about control, and you will never understand it." Elara narrowed her eyes, her voice unwavering. "Then let me make you understand something. The galaxy isn't your playground. It belongs to the people who live in it, and I will tear your network apart piece by piece if I have to." The operative didn't respond, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her confidence. Elara turned to Rallin, still on comms, voice sharp with urgency. "Rallin, I need the ship's central coordinates, now. And I need the Syndicate's top-tier data, everything." A tense silence followed, broken only by Rallin's voice, thick with static. "We've got the location. The data is stored in the core archives, but the ship's been locked down tighter than I thought. There's a failsafe that will destroy everything if we try to hack in too deep." "I don't have time for failsafes," Elara said, her tone cold as ice. "We need to access that data. Do whatever it takes to get me through." The operative, realizing the situation was slipping away, lunged for a hidden button on her wrist pad. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she shouted, just as the room's alarms blared and the walls began to close in again. But Elara was ready. With a swift motion, she threw herself at the operative, pinning her to the floor, and grabbed her wrist, forcing her hand away from the panic button. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Elara said, her voice hard with determination. "And I'll tear down every inch of your organization if that's what it takes." The operative snarled but fell silent, her shoulders sagging in defeat. Elara could feel the weight of her decision. This wasn't just about stopping a few rogue elements. It was about preventing an entire shadow organization from fracturing the galaxy into chaos. She could feel the pull of history, the consequences of failure, but Elara refused to let herself falter. Not now, not when the galaxy's future hung in the balance. With the operative restrained, Elara moved quickly to a nearby terminal, inputting commands with practiced ease. The screen flickered, then came to life, revealing the galaxy's most sensitive data. Maps of hidden Syndicate operations, secret military alliances, covert missions, it was all here. The Syndicate's true power lay not in its visible forces, but in its unseen influence over the galaxy's undercurrents. And there it was, hidden beneath layers of encryption, the Syndicate's next major move. A plan to undermine both the Vulcan and Thrin leaderships by staging a false peace treaty between the two, only to destroy both factions in a carefully timed assassination. It was a plan that would plunge the galaxy into irreversible chaos and place the Syndicate at the center of all power. Alara's eyes widened as she scrolled through the files. The scale of the operation was far worse than she had imagined. There were names, high-ranking officials in both factions, spies planted within every government. The Syndicate was more than just a threat. It was the architect of the very divisions that had torn the galaxy apart for decades. "Rallin," Alara said, her voice thick with urgency. "I found their next move. They're planning a false peace to kill both Korak and the Thrin's High Commander. We need to expose this to them before it's too late." "I'm working on it," Rallin replied. "But Alara, the Syndicate's not done. They're already moving on your location. I don't know how much time we have before they cut you off completely." Just as he finished speaking, a violent jolt rocked the ship. Alara's heart skipped a beat as she felt the unmistakable sensation of the ship's emergency thrusters kicking in. The Syndicate was abandoning the ship. But why? "We've been set up," Alara muttered under her breath. "They're not just going to kill us. They're going to use us as bait." Without another word, Alara turned toward her team. "We've got to move. Now." The ship was shifting course, and Alara's mind raced. She had the information, but without a clear escape route, she couldn't do anything with it. She needed to get off the Syndicate's vessel, and she needed to make sure the galaxy knew the truth before the Syndicate could erase all traces of their plans. "Let's go," she said, leading the charge toward the escape pods. The walls shook with another blast, and the countdown to their escape began. But Alara was not about to let the Syndicate dictate the outcome. As the countdown continued, her mind sharpened with one singular thought. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about freedom, the freedom of every person in the galaxy, and the power to tear down the chains of the Syndicate forever. The Syndicate operative, disarmed but still dangerous, glared at Alara as she stumbled back from the fight. The room was now a tangle of malfunctioning consoles and flickering lights. The automated lockdown had been temporarily disabled, but the Syndicate wasn't going to let her escape without a fight. Alara's pulse raced, and for the first time since she had stepped foot on this ship, she felt the weight of the odds against her. The operative, now kneeling but still defiant, wiped blood from her lip and stared up at Alara with a cold, calculating gaze. "You think you can stop us?" she spat. "You're just one person, and even now, your people, your precious Vulcan and Thrin, are already tearing themselves apart. No matter how many battles you fight, you'll never win the war. The Syndicate controls everything. Your alliances, your armies, your leaders, they're all ours." Alara stood over her, breathing heavily. There was no time to argue, no time for her usual diplomacy. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "Who's behind this?" Alara demanded. "Who's really in charge? Who's pulling the strings?" The operative laughed bitterly. "You think it's one person? One face you can fight and defeat? You're naive. The Syndicate is an idea. It's not about power, it's about control, and you will never understand it." Alara narrowed her eyes, her voice unwavering. "Then let me make you understand something. The galaxy isn't your playground. It belongs to the people who live in it, and I will tear your network apart piece by piece if I have to." The operative didn't respond, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her confidence. Alara turned to Rallin, still on comms, voice sharp with urgency. "Rallin, I need the ship's central coordinates now, and I need the Syndicate's top-tier data, everything." A tense silence followed, broken only by Rallin's voice, thick with static. "We've got the location. The data is stored in the core archives, but the ship's been locked down tighter than I thought. There's a failsafe that will destroy everything if we try to hack in too deep." "I don't have time for failsafes," Alara said, her tone cold as ice. "We need to access that data. Do whatever it takes to get me through." The operative, realizing the situation was slipping away, lunged for a hidden button on her wristpad. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she shouted, just as the room's alarms blared and the walls began to close in again. But Alara was ready. With a swift motion, she threw herself at the operative, pinning her to the floor, and grabbed her wrist, forcing her hand away from the panic button. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Alara said, her voice hard with determination. "And I'll tear down every inch of your organization if that's what it takes." The operative snarled but fell silent, her shoulders sagging in defeat. Alara could feel the weight of her decision. This wasn't just about stopping a few rogue elements. It was about preventing an entire shadow organization from fracturing the galaxy into chaos. She could feel the pull of history, the consequences of failure, but Alara refused to let herself falter. Not now, not when the galaxy's future hung in the balance. With the operative restrained, Alara moved quickly to a nearby terminal, inputting commands with practiced ease. The screen flickered, then came to life, revealing the galaxy's most sensitive data. Maps of hidden syndicate operations, secret military alliances, covert missions, it was all here. The syndicate's true power lay not in its visible forces, but in its unseen influence over the galaxy's undercurrents. And there it was, hidden beneath layers of encryption, the syndicate's next major move. A plan to undermine both the Vulcan and Thryn leaderships by staging a false peace treaty between the two, only to destroy both factions in a carefully timed assassination. It was a plan that would plunge the galaxy into irreversible chaos and place the syndicate at the center of all power. Alara's eyes widened as she scrolled through the files. The scale of the operation was far worse than she had imagined. There were names, high-ranking officials in both factions, spies planted within every government. The syndicate was more than just a threat. It was the architect of the very divisions that had torn the galaxy apart for decades. "Rallin," Alara said, her voice thick with urgency. "I found their next move. They're planning a false peace to kill both Korak and the Thryn's high commander. We need to expose this to them before it's too late." "I'm working on it," Rallin replied. "But Alara, the syndicate's not done. They're already moving on your location. I don't know how much time we have before they cut you off completely." Just as he finished speaking, a violent jolt rocked the ship. Alara's heart skipped a beat as she felt the unmistakable sensation of the ship's emergency thrusters kicking in. The syndicate was abandoning the ship. But why? "We've been set up," Alara muttered under her breath. "They're not just going to kill us. They're going to use us as bait." Without another word, Alara turned toward her team. "We've got to move. Now." The ship was shifting course, and Alara's mind raced. She had the information, but without a clear escape route, she couldn't do anything with it. She needed to get off the syndicate's vessel, and she needed to make sure the galaxy knew the truth before the syndicate could erase all traces of their plans. "Let's go," she said, leading the charge toward the escape pods. The wall shook with another blast, and the countdown to their escape began. But Alara was not about to let the syndicate dictate the outcome. As the countdown continued, her mind sharpened with one singular thought. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about freedom, the freedom of every person in the galaxy, and the power to tear down the chains of the syndicate forever. The escape pod's engines hummed to life, and Alara felt a surge of adrenaline as the vessel shot away from the collapsing syndicate ship. Through the small viewport, she watched the massive warship grow smaller, its dark silhouette slowly consumed by the expanse of space. But she couldn't relax, not yet. The battle was far from over. She had the data now, but the galaxy was still teetering on the edge of disaster. As the pod glided through the stars, Alara's mind raced. The syndicate's plan to destroy both the Vulcan and Thryn leaderships had been stopped, but the damage was already done. The galaxy's fragile peace had been shattered, and every faction now knew the lengths to which the syndicate would go to maintain control. Rallin, Alara said, her voice steady but urgent. I'm sending the data. I need the Vulcan and Thrin leaders to see it as soon as possible. The Syndicate's influence reaches deeper than we thought. We can't let them continue pulling the strings. There was a brief pause before Rallin's voice crackled through the comms. Understood, Ambassador, but we've got another problem. The Syndicate's fleet is already moving to intercept your escape pod. They know what we've taken, and they won't let it slide. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. She had expected retaliation, but this was faster than she anticipated. It seemed the Syndicate wasn't about to let their plans unravel without a fight. She looked at Korak, who was sitting silently across from her, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had joined her on the escape pod after his confrontation with Kalen. Ilara knew his presence wasn't just out of loyalty, it was also out of necessity. He knew the Syndicate better than anyone, and his experience would be crucial in the days to come. Rallin, prep the fleet. We need reinforcements fast. If the Syndicate's fleet engages, it's going to be a full-on battle. We don't have the luxury of a drawn-out fight, Ilara ordered, her tone sharp. I'm on it. We're sending the message to the other factions right now, but we'll need more than a few ships to stand against the Syndicate's full fleet. I'm sending coordinates for a rendezvous point. Hold tight, Ambassador. Help is coming. As Ilara closed the comms link, Korak leaned forward, his voice low and measured. You've made your stand, Ambassador, but there's no turning back now. The Syndicate will use every resource at their disposal to destroy you and the rebellion you've sparked. The only way to win this is to strike at their heart. Ilara met his gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always known the risks of challenging the Syndicate, but now, more than ever, she realized the full extent of the battle they were about to face. There could be no more running, no more diplomacy. This would be a fight to the death. We strike fast, Ilara said, her voice firm. We hit them where it hurts, before they can organize. We expose their network, dismantle their control, and show the galaxy that we're not afraid to fight for its future. Korak nodded. You'll need more than just the data. You'll need allies. The Syndicate's web is vast, but there are cracks. Some of us, those of us who have seen their true face, will help you bring it down. Ilara's mind raced as the pod continued to speed through space. She had one shot. One chance to expose the Syndicate for what they were, a cancer feeding on the chaos of the galaxy. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be betrayals, sacrifices, and losses along the way. But she had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. Ahead, the fleet would arrive soon. The Syndicate's forces would be closing in. She couldn't afford to waste time. The only way to stop them was to expose their operations and rally the galaxy's fragmented forces together before it was too late. The escape pod's internal display flickered, and Rallin's voice came through once more, this time with urgency. Ambassador, the Syndicate's fleet is coming in fast. You've got maybe 10 minutes before they're on top of you. We're preparing for a counteroffensive, but we need you to hold position. We'll engage when we get there. Ilara took a deep breath and nodded, her mind focused. This was it, the final moment of reckoning. She had the data, she had the alliances she needed. And now all that was left was to make the Syndicate pay for their endless manipulation. Hold them off, Ilara said to Korak, her voice steady with resolve. We're not leaving this fight until we bring them to their knees. Korak gave her a grim smile. You're not the only one with a score to settle. Let's make sure this ends with them. The pod's alarms suddenly blared as the Syndicate fleet came into view, a dark cloud of warships cutting through the void of space. Ilara's breath hitched as she prepared for the battle that would determine the galaxy's fate. And as the first shots were fired across the void, Ilara knew that this was only the beginning. The final chapter of the Syndicate's reign was about to be written, and she would make sure it was written in blood.